I found a diary in a motel room, and it's writing itself. Hey, I don't know if this is the right place to post this, but I need to share what happened to me last night. I can't stop thinking about it, and I don't know what to do. So, I've been on a solo road trip for the past week, just trying to clear my head after a messy breakup. Yesterday, I'd been driving for hours, and it started pouring rain, like the kind where you can't see anything in front of you. So I pulled off the highway and found this cheap motel. You know the type: flickering neon sign, paint peeling off the walls, total dive. I went to the front desk and told this guy I wanted a room. He gave me a key, I thanked him, and left. The room was exactly what you'd expect. Musty carpet, gross old bedspread, a lamp that barely worked. But there was one thing that stood out. On the nightstand, there was this notebook. It looked kind of fancy, like leather-bound and old. Way too nice for a place like that. I wouldn't have thought much of it, but when I picked it up, the first page had something written on it. This is your story now. I don't know why, but it creeped me out. I figured it was some kind of weird joke from a previous guest. I put it back on the nightstand and went to bed. Okay, this is where it gets really weird. This morning, when I woke up, the notebook wasn't on the nightstand anymore. It was on the bed, right next to me. And it wasn't blank anymore. There were pages and pages of writing, and I swear it was describing everything I did yesterday. Pulling off the highway because of the rain, checking in at the front desk, meeting the guy there. His name tag said Ron. I didn't even know his name myself. And even the exact moment I opened the notebook. Then there was a new line at the bottom of the last page. It said, I'd wake up this morning and read what it wrote. And that's exactly what's happening. But the best part, as the last thing it said, don't leave the motel. So yeah, I'm freaking out a little bit. I packed up my stuff and decided to leave right away. I threw the notebook in my bag and went out to my car. But when I tried to start it, nothing happened. Not even a click. I went back to the front desk to ask for help, and Ron just shrugged. He said something like, "Your car was working fine yesterday, wasn't it?" Then he said it wasn't his problem. I tried calling a tow truck, but I don't have any service out here. I ended up going back to my room to figure out what to do, and guess what? The notebook was back on the nightstand. Not in my bag, on the nightstand. It was open to a new page. It said, "You can't leave." Last night, I couldn't sleep. I started hearing noises outside my door, like footsteps. At first, I thought it was just another guest, but then it sounded like they were pacing back and forth. I looked out the window, but the parking lot was empty. Then I heard knocking. It wasn't loud, just this slow, deliberate knock. I froze. I didn't know what to do, so I asked, "Who's there?" No one answered. I went back to the notebook, and there was a new sentence. It said, "Don't open the door." So I didn't. I have no idea what's going on. I don't even know if I should keep reading this thing. Part of me wants to throw it out, but another part of me feels like I need to see what it says next. I'm posting this because I'm hoping someone else has experienced something like this. Or maybe you can tell me I'm just overthinking it. I'll update if anything else happens. I wish I never opened my father's box. When my father died, he left me his box. A part of me wishes he hadn't, but the truth is, I knew one day it would be mine. He always said it would be, like some terrible inheritance, like a burden he'd pass down, one way or another. Even in death, he was right. Dad wasn't the kind of man you write fond eulogies about. He wasn't the kind you remembered with fond nostalgia or a soft chuckle at family gatherings. He was the kind you whispered about behind closed doors and prayed with everything you had that he'd change before it was too late. He had a way of looming over everything, controlling everything. Our house, our lives, my childhood. And when he wasn't looming or controlling, he was watching. Everything. Always. "It's your inheritance," he'd say, fingers brushing the dark wooden box like it was alive. "Someday, you'll understand why." But I never understood. Not as a kid, not as an adult. Not until the box was handed to me, cold and heavy, at the funeral home. "Leave it," my husband Rob said when I brought it into the house. His voice was soft, like he was worried it would break something if he spoke too loudly. "I can't," I said. "I wish I could, but it's mine." It sat on the dining room table for days. Ellie, our 6-year-old, asked about it constantly, her curious eyes shining like it was some kind of treasure chest. "Is it a treasure?" she asked, tilting her head. "No," I said too quickly, a little too sharply. "It's just something Grandpa wanted me to have." Ellie didn't push, but I could feel her gaze lingering on the box. It wasn't the way she stared at it, curious, innocent, but something in the way her eyes lingered, like she could hear its whispers too. I didn't tell her, but I could feel it, the way the box seemed to look back at her, as if it knew she was there. We never talked about it directly, but when the sun dipped low and the house settled into its usual suffocating silence, I could hear it again, the soft, almost imperceptible murmurs coming from the box, tugging at the edges of my mind, like an itch under your skin you just can't scratch. I hadn't touched it in months at this point. I hadn't dared. But every night, the whispers got louder, until it was all I could hear. My nerves frayed like the edges of old fabric, snapping with tension. Ellie hadn't noticed, or maybe she didn't care to, but it was all I could think about. The shadows grew longer, darker, and the box seemed to pull them in with it. I started waking up to the smell of old wood, like something decaying, and I could swear the air around it grew colder every night. One night, the whispers grew sharp, like 1,000 needles pressing against my skull. I didn't want to open it, but I couldn't help myself. I had to know. I had to know what he left me, what he left behind. I gave in. I opened it. Inside was nothing. Not empty, exactly. The dark interior seemed deeper than it should have been, like it stretched into some bottomless void. Staring into it made my stomach twist, but what made my breath catch in my throat was the smell, faint but unmistakable. Pall Mall cigarettes, sweat, single malt whiskey. My father. I slammed the lid shut, but the box didn't stay quiet. And then a few days later, I saw him. Ellie woke me in the middle of the night, crying about a man in her room. "What man?" I asked, flipping on the light, my heart racing in my chest. "The pale-faced one," she whispered, her voice barely audible as she pointed to the corner. There was no one there, but as I bent down to comfort her, I caught the most subtle movement out of the corner of my eye, a figure, thin and colorless, disappearing into the hallway. Then came the faint smell of cigarettes, whiskey, and sweat. I couldn't say it out loud, but I knew. I knew who she had seen. Rob said it was just a nightmare, but Ellie wasn't the only one seeing him. The pale-faced man appeared in the hallway at the foot of my bed, reflected in the mirror when I turned away. He wasn't just there. He lingered, his hollow eyes meeting mine, his presence prickling at something deep inside me. Something I thought I had buried long ago. I could feel it then, the shadow of something I couldn't outrun. Something I thought I had put to rest. My father's sickness. One night, when Rob was working late and Ellie was asleep, I opened the box again. I don't know what I expected. Maybe to find a way to make it stop. I wanted to inspect it, see if there was something I had missed. But instead, there was something inside this time. A photo. It was of me, maybe 8 or 9 years old. My father's hand rested on my shoulder, but it didn't look like his hand. It was pale, thin, and bony, curling around me like it belonged to something that didn't belong in this world. I turned the photo over. Written on the back, in his shaky handwriting, were the words, "He is always watching. You cannot escape him." The box didn't just hold memories, it held a piece of my father's sickness, the weight of all the things I couldn't explain as a child, but now felt with perfect clarity. The pale-faced man wasn't a stranger. He was the shadow of something my father had let in. Or maybe something he was. Ellie began waking up more often, crying about the man in her room. "He's angry," she said one night, her little voice trembling. "He says I have to go with him to a secret place, that it won't hurt." "No," I whispered, holding her tight, as the weight of the words crushed my chest. "He's lying." But I knew the truth. The box didn't just pass down, it infected. My father's sickness had been handed to me, and now it was trying to take my daughter. That night, I carried the box to the backyard. The air was cold, and the pale-faced man was waiting, standing just beyond the tree line. His hollow eyes met mine, his mouth twitching like he was trying to smile. "You can't destroy it," he said, his voice like dry leaves scraping against the pavement. I didn't answer. Instead, I opened the box one last time. Inside, I saw every moment I'd ever buried. The times I'd convinced myself were misunderstandings or dreams. His hand on my shoulder, thigh, the silence I was told to keep. I stared at the pale-faced man, and for the first time, I didn't look away. "You're not him," I said, my voice breaking. "You're just what he made." His expression didn't change, but something shifted. The air grew colder, the world around me quiet and suffocating. "You can't destroy it," he repeated, each word more menacing than the last. "Watch me," I said, my voice hoarse. I dropped the box into the fire pit, dousing it with gasoline. The pale-faced man stepped closer, his hollow eyes wide, but I didn't care. I struck the match, and as the flames took hold of the box, I heard him speak one last time. "You can't burn it away." I looked up. He was gone. Ellie doesn't wake up crying anymore. The house feels lighter, warmer, but sometimes, late at night, I still smell the faint scent of cigarettes and whiskey mixed with sweat. It's fleeting, but enough to remind me. I know the box is gone, but I also know that its shadow will linger forever. My father's secrets didn't die with him, and his sickness isn't something you can just burn away completely. But I'll be damned if I ever let it touch her. The lighthouse, I had known Hugh since childhood, but by this time, I hadn't seen him for several years. You know how it goes. By the time you reach the 9th grade, you promise to be best friends forever, then you go out 3 times to the pub during high school, and that's the end of it. But Hugh probably didn't want it to end that way, and so a few months ago, a letter arrived in my mailbox. "Dear Dennis, I haven't seen you in a long time. If you ever want to come see me at the lighthouse, wait for me at Miami Harbor, dock number 608, any even Wednesday at dawn. Or you can make your way here on foot. It's about 30 miles east of South Beach, though I would strongly advise against it. Hopefully, we'll see each other soon. Hugh Collins." It struck me as strange how he assumed it was obvious that he lived in a lighthouse. One part of me thought the trip was a ridiculous waste of time, while another kept reminding me that there was nothing to do at home anyway. At that time, I was mostly living off my father's inheritance and the small jobs people occasionally offered me. After my father's death, I was on one hand financially secure, and on the other, bored out of my mind because, although taking care of him had been a real drag, at least it kept me busy enough not to notice the emptiness of my life. In the end, I realized that I had nothing else to do, so I decided to go. That very day, I went to the Greyhound Line's office and booked a ticket for the next bus to Miami. I packed a small bag, and the next morning, I patiently waited at Port Authority bus terminal until a shabby-looking vessel, which the driver called Baby, arrived. When I was young, my parents would punish me by making me kneel on a spoon, and despite that, I can honestly say the hours spent in that bus were the longest I've ever experienced. By early Wednesday morning, I arrived in Miami and immediately hurried to the harbor. At dock number 608, a man in shorts, a sailor's shirt, and a cap was standing. He had short hair and scruffy facial hair. "Dennis, is that you?" he asked. "I'm so glad to see you, old buddy." He smiled and shook my hand warmly. It had been about 10 years since I last saw him, but he looked like he had aged about 25 years. On our way to the market to buy supplies, we chatted about life and how much everything had changed. I was really curious how someone ends up as a lighthouse keeper. "It's simple, my friend. You carefully watch the classifieds in the newspapers, and when they don't have any ads, you look for articles like "Desperate Keeper Committed Suicide by Jumping Off the Lighthouse." That usually means they have a job opening. This is the third lighthouse I've worked at. The previous two stopped functioning. Nowadays, everything's transported by airplane, and the lighthouse keepers don't have much to eat. He sighed, but then laughed again. It turned out that he hadn't really changed much since I last saw him, around the end of high school. After a pleasant lunch and the obligatory visit to the liquor store on 22nd Street, we boarded a small boat and embarked on a 2-hour journey to the lighthouse. On the island, the warm wind blew and the sky was a deep azure. It kind of reminded me of the planet of the Little Prince, because from one end, where the dock was, you could see all the way to the other end, where a sharp, rocky outcrop stood. "Hey Hugh, what's that over there?" "That's a cave. I used to go swimming there, but a few months ago, some stones fell from the ceiling, and now it's a bit dangerous because of the waves." I assumed Hugh spoke from experience, because when I asked, a nervous look appeared in his eyes. It was beginning to get dark, so we started a fire and threw a few steaks on the grill. And since God doesn't look after us after dark, we had to open the bottle of wild turkey we had bought earlier. The whiskey Hugh liked. Maybe it was the fire, or perhaps just the atmosphere, but that steak, straight off the grill, was the best piece of meat that had ever touched my lips. "Aren't you ever afraid to be out here? I heard there are some treacherous waves or something, that ships sink and planes crash and so on," I asked as the moon rose directly above us and we moved inside because it was time to signal the Cuban steamer that we were where we were supposed to be. "Afraid to sail? I'd have to be a real coward to be afraid of these little waves," he replied, gesturing toward the sea, where the reflection of the moon and stars shimmered on the water. "But the night here on the island can be eerily quiet, you know, especially since I've been alone here. Has anyone been with you? Didn't something happen, like the thing you told me about from the newspaper?" At that moment, I regretted asking anything. I had driven my host into a very uncomfortable conversation. "I didn't mention it." He paused. "I used to have a dog named Ronnie and a wife, Isla. One day, Ronnie wandered off somewhere, and Isla..." He stopped again, and it seemed like he was fighting back tears. "Isla got some sort of disease here and died almost overnight. The whole family blames me. I should have taken her away from here. I basically killed her." Hugh's head dropped into his hands, and I didn't know what to say. Suddenly, we were interrupted by the sound of crying. At first, I thought it was Hugh, but then he lifted his head and showed no signs of sobbing or sniffing. "What's that, Hugh?" I asked, though I briefly wondered if it was a product of my tipsy mind. "The Grey Lady, that's what the locals call her. They say she was a woman who shipwrecked here years ago and died of hunger, and she still cries to this day. The truth, and the scientists have confirmed it, is that it's some sound the waves make, shifting through the peculiar arch of that cave. That piqued my curiosity, and I really wanted to go see the cave." Hugh looked at me again, with a nervous smile. "If the conditions are good tomorrow morning, I could show you." I tried to get more local ghost stories out of him, in the hope that we might at least leave the dead wife subject for another night. He told me he knew none, except for a tale about a pirate's ghost from Brickleberry. "Bummer. Want a drink?" I asked. He agreed, and we had a drink. Then, I probably fell asleep. It was already well past 2 in the morning. The sound of crying woke me up again. I chuckled under my breath at the story of the Grey Lady, and then decided I might as well take a trip to the latrine while I was awake. I opened my eyes and noticed that Hugh was sitting at the end of the bed, his head in his hands again. I was about to say something to reassure him it wouldn't be that bad, but somehow I couldn't move. God, I was tied up. Hugh turned toward me, and I noticed the knife in his left hand. He began to scream. It became clear that Hugh wasn't just a nice guy, but also possibly a cannibal. He covered my mouth. "You don't understand. She's hungry. She would take me. I can't go to hell without a fight, not after what I did. I had to." He repeated the last sentence over and over as I felt a sharp pain and warm blood somewhere in my stomach. My eyes closed, and I knew the game was over. The last words I heard were, "It wasn't your fault. She's to blame. That monster. That monster." And at the very end, something clicked for me. I didn't resist. He was right. He had to. Look what the tide washed. Ollie and I had recently gotten into making handmade jewelry out of sea glass. It was a pretty fun way to spend time together, and it carries the added bonus of generating some decent pocket change when we manage to sell the stuff we make at the monthly community market in the neighborhood. We'd only been at it for a few weeks, but we'd already gotten pretty good. We splurged early on a nice set of pliers and some decent jewelry wire, and we could make earrings and necklaces pretty consistently at a quality that he would likely describe as mediocre plus. It's not the kind of stuff you'd see at a department store, but you might be inclined to spend a few bucks on it if you were walking by and the sunlight caught the sea glass in just the right way. We started making our stuff in late January, when a spontaneous beach trip with no planning led to a pretty pleasant afternoon of sitting around and watching the waves. Ollie had just picked me up from work and decided that we should take a 20-minute detour on the way home to check out the beach because it was, as he put it, cold enough to keep the fake fans at home. Ollie had a unique way of talking that had a tendency to confuse those who didn't know him. I always viewed it as one of his many acquired tastes. After half an hour of walking along the shore, I noticed a little flash of green in the carpet of shells that the tide had washed in. I snatched it quickly and was delighted to find that it was an old shard of a beer bottle, rendered completely smooth by natural rock-tumbling effect of the sand and tide. Ollie thought it was really cool and had the idea of turning it into a necklace for me, and thus the hobby project began. Since then, we've made sea glass, gathering a part of our weekly routine. There's a certain thrill to it. You have to find a patch of shore that's densely covered with shells, and then you hunker down right at the edge of the tide. If you do it right, you'll have a few seconds between waves to quickly scan the new debris brought in by the sea and grab anything that looks like it fits the bill. Mostly we find green bits of the smooth glass, but on rare occasions we'll come across some clear or brown pieces, and on one occasion I managed to snap up a small penny-sized shard of bright blue glass before it was whipped back into the ocean by the tide. The glass itself is gorgeous. If you look at it while it's wet, it's mostly transparent, but as soon as it dries off, it becomes opaque. Ollie attempted to explain this to me once. He said it has to do with light refraction and water filling the gaps of the rough surface. I didn't have the heart to tell him that I don't really care about the science of it. I just think it's neat looking, and I'm happy to leave it at that. Last week, we went out to gather some glass, a little later than usual because I had a work meeting that ran long. We brought along a couple of sandwiches for dinner and a canvas tote bag containing what had become our usual equipment. A couple of cotton pouches with drawstrings that we used to collect the shards we found, and 2 large sifters, the kind a baker uses for getting clumps out of cocoa powder. We got to the beach about half an hour before sunset and immediately got to work. I set up near a rocky outcropping in a patch that had yielded good results in the past, and Ollie walked a few yards down the shoreline to a spot where a little peninsula of beach juts out into the ocean, kind of like a tiny model of the state of Florida. After a solid 20 minutes of sifting, I took a break to eat my sandwich and check my phone. I called out to Ollie, but he didn't respond. I looked over at his spot a few yards away and saw him squatting in the shallow water with his back to me. I called out to him again and got no response. He just crouched there completely motionless with his head down, looking into the water. I got up and walked over to check on him, and as I approached, he still didn't move. I asked if he heard me call out to him, and he responded with a quick, "Mm-hmm." I asked him what he was doing, and after a long silence, he just held out his hand in my direction, palm upturned, still staring intently into the sand by his feet as the waves pushed and pulled new shells past them. Sitting in the center of his palm was a deep red piece of sea glass, about the size of a guitar pick. As I reached out to take it from him, his voice was sudden and unusually serious. "Don't drop it." As I took it out of his hand, he retracted his arm and spoke in a quiet voice, almost to himself. "There's another one here somewhere." I turned the shard over in my hand, being very careful not to fumble it into the tide that lapped at my feet. It was an almost square piece of glass, about 2.5 centimeters wide. It was slightly tapered so that on one end it was about a centimeter narrower than the other, making it look kind of like a rounded-off triangle. It also had a slight curve to it, as if it had once been the wall of a container. That was nothing unusual, of course, but it was odd in that it wasn't completely smooth on both of its faces. It has some distinct shapes and bumps on the inner side, like it had been carved or blown into some kind of complex mold when it was produced. Another weird thing about it was its color, a deep, rich red that reminded me of cherry hard candy. I had never seen a piece of sea glass this color before. Whoa! Ollie didn't respond immediately, but standing behind him, I eventually heard his voice drift up from his hunched-over figure. "Put water on it." I carefully reached down and dipped my free hand into the water and let a few drops fall from my fingertips and onto the glass surface. Oh wow! As it came into contact with the water, the glass immediately became transparent, and beneath the thin shard surface, I saw some kind of internal carvings. It was like a series of small hairline fractures near the center of the glass that mirrored the carvings on its surface, but the internal shapes were giving off a faint light, like an incandescent light bulb glowing slightly after it's been turned off. The carvings themselves were unlike anything I'd seen. The easiest way to describe them is that they were hard to understand. Not only the images they formed, but the shapes themselves were hard to understand. Their edges and angles didn't make sense, and looking at it made me feel a weird lurching feeling in my stomach. "Wow, what is this?" Ollie didn't respond. "You said there's another one?" He grunted in the affirmative and spoke again after a long pause. Wasn't fast enough to grab both. I looked again at the glass and then back at Ollie, stooped over the water. "You haven't seen the other one again?" No response. I looked at the horizon and watched the sun slowly complete its descent beneath the distant ocean. I bit my lip. "It's getting pretty late though, and now it's kind of dark. Do you think we can come back and look for it tomorrow after work?" His response was immediate. "I'm not leaving until I find it. You can go home and come help me tomorrow morning." I was stunned at how cold and direct his response was. "What the hell?" No response. "Seriously, what the hell, Ollie? You really expect me to go home and leave you here at the beach overnight?" Ollie said nothing. I spent another 10 minutes yelling at him, telling him he was being childish and irresponsible. We both had work in the morning, and he was only dressed in a long-sleeved t-shirt and jeans, far from appropriate for an impromptu all-nighter on the beach during the winter. For the entire time, Ollie was completely still, saying nothing, just staring into the water. At that point, I bitterly announced that I was taking the car and leaving, and that he could find his own way home before spinning on my heel and beginning a march away from the shore. "Wait." I stopped and looked back at him. He was still in the same position, but his hand was outstretched behind him in my general direction. "Give it back." I was furious. "Fuck you, Ollie. You can come get it at home." At this, Ollie stood up and turned to face me. His arms hung limply at his sides. His face was expressionless, and his eyes were bloodshot and streaked with veins. I realized with shock that he really hadn't blinked this whole time. "Give it back to me, or I'll hurt you until you do." I let out a choked sob and threw the shard of glass in a high arc over his head, and hesitated, waiting to see how he would react. The moment it left my hand, his eyes darted into the air, and when he couldn't find the piece of glass in the darkness, he quickly spun around and waited silently, his muscles tensed like a runner before the starting gun. A second later, there was a small sound, almost imperceptible, over the sound of the light waves lapping at the shells in the sand. With a sickening pop, Ollie's head jerked suddenly to face the sound, and he dived with Olympic force toward the shard's point of entry into the sea. There was an immense thrashing in the water as he kicked his way below the surface, and moments later, the ocean was calm. After a few seconds without him surfacing, I ran splashing into the water myself, feeling around the seabed with my feet, raking my hands through the water in wide, panicked arcs. For hours, I called out for him and continued my crazed search along the shore for a mile in both directions from the peninsula where he had disappeared, until I finally collapsed on the beach, exhausted. For the past week, there's been no sign of Ollie. No texts, no calls. He hasn't shown up at home. He's just gone. I filed a report with the police, and after a few interviews, they've let me know that they don't need my help for now, and they'll let me know if they find any sign of him. But really, I do know where he is. I see him at night, when my tears and racking sobs at his loss have carried me to sleep. He is there, crouched on the ground and still as a statue, watching me with his red, unblinking eyes. He reaches out a hand and calls me toward him, pulling me closer to the city behind him. A towering city of carved red glass with shapeless glowing spires that jut into the sky at unspeakable angles, casting upward shadows onto the ocean's surface above. The dancing shapes within each wall pull my mind into ribbons of cherry candy, and I wake to find that my eyes are dry and sore and strained from blindly staring at the ceiling as I sleep. Tonight, I will return to the beach to find him. It will be easy. I will follow the light beneath the waves. Jake's mum was dying, and he had to get to her before it was too late. He had no time to figure out what was happening on the drive. Jake parked and walked into the low diner with its comforting lights brightening up the dead dark night. He was famished, not having eaten for hours, and even though he knew he didn't have much longer to drive, and he was desperate to see his dying mother, he had to get a bite. He told himself it was better to eat now than show up at the hospice hungry and unable to pay attention to what was happening. He almost stumbled into the diner. Inside was as comforting as the lights promised it to be, and although it was well after midnight, there was a few patrons dotted around the plastic red tables, their hands curled around war-steaming mugs, their faces dipped towards plates of comfort food. He couldn't smell anything, and he somehow noticed that, and the silence. No clinking of cutlery, no coffee, and bacon aroma. Well, he'd been driving along the dark highway for hours, focused on getting to his mother while trying to keep his looming grief at bay. No wonder his senses were out of joint. There was nothing out of joint in the hot plate of food the smiling server pushed over to him. He couldn't remember what he ordered in his heightened emotional state, just that it was plentiful, warm, cheesy, gravy, meaty. He shoveled it into his mouth, feeling the energy and goodness radiating along his tired limbs. He was grateful to the server for not chatting to him, understanding his wordless need for distance. He sipped the coffee, and it was perfect. Not too hot, not too cold. He didn't burn his mouth, and he gratefully took a huge gulp. The dark liquid flowed through his veins, lifting the veil of fatigue, and he looked around, taking slightly more interest in his surroundings. The server was pretty, but he couldn't dally. He would never forgive himself if he arrived too late. The hospice staff had been kind, but clear. He pushed his credit card to the pretty server. She smiled even more broadly and said something he couldn't hear or understand. On the house. But why? He didn't have time to discuss. If they didn't want his money, fine. He pocketed his wallet, nodded, and headed out. His sense of urgency heightened. He almost missed the door, narrowly avoiding walking into the wall. Heavy darkness still blanketed the stretch of highway. He looked back at the diner, its twinkling lights still advertising "Diner, open," the only lights visible. The windows were dark. What? He didn't have time to wonder. He had to get to his mother, and with his belly full of warm, lovely food, there were no more excuses to dally. But he needed gas. Luckily, there was a gas station just on the other side of the highway. Carefully, he drove in, and as he got out, the first rays of dawn pierced the darkness. Pumping gas, he glanced over his shoulder. In the grey light, he couldn't see the diner lights at all. No building. The other side of the highway was just emptiness. Jake cried out despite himself. An elderly man, pumping next to him, looked up. "Son?" Jake closed his mouth, then opened it again. There was a diner there, he muttered, and with his free hand pointed across the highway to the patch of grey nothing. The man said grimly, "Son, you can't be from around here if you don't know what happened there. That old diner closed after all that hullabaloo died down and got torn down few years back. Nobody was eating there no more." Jake stood, quite still. He could still feel the warmth of the food in his body, the aftertaste of coffee in his mouth. He looked at the old man, who was minding his business pumping gas. He needed to get back on the road. He had to get to his mother. He couldn't stop and argue. Quickly, he swiped his credit card and paid for the gas, jumped into his car, and tore off. The missing room. In the late 1990s, a woman named Claire moved into an old apartment building in Chicago. The building had been constructed in the early 1900s, and while it had been renovated several times, its age was evident in the creaky floors and outdated fixtures. Claire loved its vintage charm and the affordable rent. One day, while chatting with her elderly neighbor, Mrs. Langley, Claire learned something unsettling. The building originally had 14 apartments, but now there were only 13. One of the apartments, Unit 7, had been sealed off decades ago. When Claire asked why, Mrs. Langley simply said, "It's better that way." Curiosity gnawed at Claire. She started asking other tenants about Unit 7. Most shrugged her off, but a younger tenant mentioned hearing strange noises coming from the wall where the unit supposedly was. Scratching, faint whispers, even the sound of furniture being dragged. Determined to find out more, Claire visited the city archives. She discovered that in 1952, a man named Harold Grayson lived in Unit 7. Harold was a reclusive artist who rarely left his apartment. One night, his neighbors reported hearing him scream, followed by a loud crash. When the police arrived, they found the apartment completely empty. No furniture, no art supplies, and no Harold. The windows were locked from the inside, and there was no sign of forced entry. Harold was never seen again. Claire became obsessed. She started investigating the wall where Unit 7 should have been. One night, armed with a hammer, she decided to chip away at the plaster. Behind it, she found a door. The door was covered in deep scratches, as if someone or something had tried desperately to claw their way out. Despite every instinct telling her not to, Claire opened it. Inside was a small, dark room, with walls covered in strange, childlike drawings. Stick figures with distorted faces surrounded a central figure, a tall, shadowy shape with unnaturally long arms. On the floor was a single chair facing the wall, and carved into the wood were the words, "It never left." As Claire stepped inside, she heard the door slam shut behind her. The light from her flashlight flickered and died, plunging her into darkness. Her neighbors found her the next morning, curled up outside her apartment, muttering incoherently. She refused to speak about what happened, but she moved out the following day. To this day, the building remains standing, and Unit 7 is still sealed. Tenants occasionally report hearing noises from behind the wall, but no one dares investigate. They all agree on one thing. Whatever happened to Harold Grayson and Claire is better left alone. The hunter's eye. I always knew I was different. Not like the other cats. They would play with their prey, chasing, pouncing, making a game of it. But I didn't. I would watch, still as stone, my tail flicking with an unsettling calmness. When the others would claw at the mouse, I would sit back, my eyes fixed, unblinking, studying. I was raised in the silence of shadows, in a place where even the wind dared not whisper. I am a cat, yes, but I am more than that. I was chosen. It was him, the one I call Master. He found me as a kitten, a tiny bundle of fur, with eyes too sharp for my age. He picked me up with gloved hands and whispered something I didn't understand at the time. He had been watching me long before I knew what it was like to hunt. I can still feel his fingers pressing against my soft fur, the coldness in them, and the absence of warmth in his touch. Master never spoke much, but I understood. It wasn't words that mattered, It was what he did. His hands, stained with something darker than ink, would often stroke my fur in a way that made my hairs stand on end, as though he was grooming me for something more, something bigger than the other cats could ever understand. He was a killer, a predator in human skin. I could sense it before I saw the bodies, before I knew the smell of death that would seep into the air, thick and sticky. But death wasn't new to me. It never had been. Not after all the nights I'd watched him, listened to the rhythmic, soothing sound of the blade cutting through flesh. Sometimes he would bring me to the scene, his eyes gleaming with an unspoken thrill. His whispers to me, those cold, dispassionate tones, were lessons. "This is how it's done," he would say without words. "You have to be still. You have to wait. Wait for the right moment." I learned quickly. He taught me how to watch, how to listen for the faintest sound, how to stalk without making a sound, just like him. He would often make me stay in the shadows, hidden from view, as he played his sick games with others. And each time I was there, the unseen presence, the silent observer, learning to be. I wasn't a pet. No, that would be too simple, too kind. I was an extension of him. I was his accomplice, his mirror, his tool. The others, people he brought into his web, didn't see me for what I was. At first, they thought I was cute, soft, harmless. But then, they would notice the way I watched them, eyes narrowed, never blinking. The way I would sit at the edge of the room, so close to them, but never quite touching. They would laugh at my stillness, even mock it, thinking they were safe. They never were. Master never made a sound when he killed. Neither did I. The knife would flash, a quick, decisive movement. The breath would leave them in a sharp gasp. But it was the silence that followed that I craved. That was when I was most like him, when the moment of fear was gone, and the thrill of the hunt was finished. It was over, and only the stillness remained. One night, things changed. He wasn't alone in the room. I could smell another presence, one that was different from his usual victims. I could feel the tension in the air. The woman, she had been laughing just moments before. A high, shrill sound that cut through the silence of the house. She was sitting on the couch, eyes wide, blinking rapidly as though something had just hit her. She didn't see me, of course. She never saw me coming. The darkness was my ally, and as always, I waited. I waited for the right moment, the right move. I watched her squirm, her eyes darting around the room, catching glimpses of the dark shapes moving in the corners. She could feel it. She didn't know what it was, but she could feel the eyes of the hunter. Master had already moved, slipping behind her, his breath steady and cold. But something was wrong. I could sense it. The fear in the air was thicker than usual. He wasn't just killing tonight. He was hunting for something else, something he hadn't prepared me for. I froze. For the first time, I felt something stir in my gut. Not fear, not hunger, something darker, a challenge. The woman's breathing grew ragged. She turned suddenly, as though sensing something, sensing me. Her eyes locked onto mine, and for a fleeting moment, I saw a reflection in her gaze. Not just a cat, not just a predator, but something more. She knew. She felt the darkness. Master's grip tightened around her neck. But before the final cut, before he could end it, she did something unexpected. With a swift movement, she grabbed the nearest object, a sharp, broken shard of glass, and hurled it toward me. I didn't flinch. I didn't move. But that was the moment I realized what I had to do. I lunged. The woman screamed as I sank my teeth into her throat, my claws raking through her flesh. The room was filled with chaos, but all I could hear was the sound of my own heartbeat, steady and calm. She fought, she screamed, but it didn't matter. Not to me, not to him. Master watched, his eyes wide with something I had never seen before. Surprise, but he didn't intervene. He never did. This was part of the lesson. He had taught me well after all. The world was full of victims, but only the strongest survived. When it was over, when she was gone, I stepped back, licking my claws. Master knelt beside me, his expression unreadable. He placed his gloved hand on my fur, his fingers trembling slightly. Good. He whispered the word. The only word he ever said after my work was done. Good. And I knew then. I was ready. I was no longer just a cat. I was his successor. The hunter's eye, always watching, always waiting. I think something is haunting me. Can someone help? I think something is haunting me. What do you guys think? So, to start things off, I'm a Christian who's always been a believer. My parents both grew up in households where activity was quite frequent. More in my dad's house than my mum's, but both had decent activity. My dad's family is very scared of this ghost that they have the house blessed every year now in hopes to ward anything away. Recently, I bought an Ouija board to play with, but I got yelled at and was told to return before I even opened it. It's currently sitting in my garage, unopened. It all started after I was on an angry rant saying how ghosts aren't real, and my dad's ghost and my mom's ghost never was real and all a lie. I kept going on saying ghosts aren't real. My parents just kept telling me how they are very real and I shouldn't be saying those things. 3 days ago, I'm in my basement by myself and something falls off the shelf. It could be explained by the music playing on the Alexa, but there was no vibration. It landed decently far, like it was thrown from the shelf. The next thing happened yesterday when me and my girlfriend were hanging out at her dad's. First thing that happened was the garage door swung open, all the way open, when it was latched. I got up and closed it and said it was probably a draft to calm her down a little bit. Then, not even 2 minutes later, we hear what sounds like running around in the garage, and something fell. At the point, I didn't check it out because I was startled. We ignored it and continued playing Xbox. Then 5 minutes later, we heard the other garage door that lead into the garage completely slam. Again, this door was latched 5 minutes ago. We told her dad, and he checked everything, and no one was there. That was that for the night after that. Then today, we were taking a nap in the same room, and both my arms were in front of her, and she was in my chest. She woke up from my dad texting me, and she said she closed her eyes and she felt what felt like 3 fingers with long nails poking into her side, slowly, and didn't stop. She said she slowly turned and looked and felt the fingers pull away very quickly. She was very startled and was freaking out. All of this has happened in the last week, and I would just like to know what other people's thoughts are. Also, previously, we were sitting in her basement, and I was looking into her eyes, and in the back behind her, I am positive I saw a white flash scream across the back on the basement, and I was put into a shock. What do you guys think is going on? We would appreciate anything. The Descent of Elias. Elias Matthews lived a life that many would envy. A simple, unremarkable existence in a bustling city where he worked as a software engineer. His days were spent coding algorithms in a small, sterile office, surrounded by the hum of computers and the glow of fluorescent lights. He wasn't a man of thrills or adventure. Rather, he found solace in routine. Weekends were for grocery runs, long walks in the park, and quiet evenings at home with a book or a documentary. But one fateful night, everything changed. It began at a bar, a place Elias rarely visited. His friend Mike had dragged him out, insisting that he needed to get out more and live a little. Elias wasn't in the mood, but he went along. That night, the bar was filled with laughter and the clinking of glasses, but one person stood out among the crowd: Lilith. She wasn't like the others. There was something strange about her, something magnetic that made Elias's gaze linger. She had jet black hair, dark eyes that seemed to swallow the light around her, and lips painted the color of deep crimson. She wasn't loud or boisterous like the rest of the crowd. Instead, she sat at the far corner, sipping her drink and observing the room with an unsettling calm. Elias couldn't help himself. He found himself drawn to her, and before he knew it, he was sitting beside her, nervously sipping his own beer. She didn't speak much, but her presence was enough to make him feel things he hadn't felt in years: desire, curiosity, a pull he couldn't explain. "Are you always so quiet?" she asked, her voice like velvet. Elias, startled by her sudden attention, stammered, "I'm not usually the type to go out." She smiled, and for a moment, Elias thought he saw something flicker in her eyes, something predatory. "Maybe you should change that," she said, her gaze locking with his. "You might find more than you expect." That night, they talked until the bar closed. There was an easy chemistry between them, a strange comfort despite how different they seemed. Lilith was enigmatic, speaking in riddles and half-truths, but Elias found it captivating. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but he felt that she was not entirely human. When she invited him to her apartment the next evening, something inside him, something dark and longing, urged him to say yes. Elias arrived at her apartment, a sleek, modern building on the edge of the city. The air felt different here, heavy and thick, as if the space itself was holding a secret. Lilith welcomed him inside, offering him a glass of wine. They talked for hours, the conversation shifting from light banter to deeper, more intimate topics. But there was always something strange about it. She would glance at him with a hunger in her eyes, like she was studying him, evaluating him. Finally, as the night deepened, the mood shifted. She stood up slowly, her movements almost feline. "You've been so good, Elias," she whispered, "but I think you're ready now." Elias didn't understand what she meant, but he was no longer thinking clearly. A fog had descended over his mind, and when she kissed him, it felt like the world had stopped. Her lips were cold at first, but the moment they touched his, a fire spread through his veins. She pulled away, her eyes glowing with an unnatural light. "You've been marked," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "Tonight, you belong to me." Elias, still dazed from the kiss, stumbled back. "What do you mean? I don't understand." But before he could say anything more, his body felt strange, too warm, like his blood was boiling. He stumbled to the bathroom mirror, his reflection staring back at him, and that's when he saw it. His eyes, once brown and ordinary, were now a glowing crimson. His pupils had elongated, and his skin seemed unnaturally pale, as though the very life had been drained from him. "What have you done to me?" he gasped, his voice trembling. Lilith appeared behind him, her eyes dark with satisfaction. "I've given you what you wanted, Elias. You always longed for something more, something deeper. Now you've tasted it, and you can never go back." Panic surged within him. He felt something stirring in his chest, something ancient and dangerous. His thoughts began to twist and warp, filled with a hunger that was not his own. The man he had been, quiet, kind, reserved, seemed so distant now, like a ghost he could barely remember. "Why me?" he asked, his voice barely recognizable. Lilith's lips curled into a smile, the smile of a predator. "Because you were ready. You wanted to feel more, to break free of the cage you built for yourself. Now, you're mine, Elias, and you will become what I am." The days that followed were a blur. Elias felt the demon within him slowly taking control, creeping into his thoughts like poison. His once clear mind became clouded with dark desires. He began to lose his temper more easily, snapping at co-workers, growing impatient with the smallest inconveniences. The hunger, the need for power, for chaos, began to consume him. He would look at the people around him and see them as prey, insignificant, beneath him. His reflection in the mirror was no longer his own. His eyes were permanently red now, and his once human face had become sharp and angular, a twisted version of what he had been. He could feel the change deep within him. The claws of the demon were fully out now, digging into his soul. But it wasn't just the physical transformation that terrified him. It was the slow, creeping realization that he liked it. He liked the power, the control, the way people trembled when he walked past them. He could hear the whispers now, voices in his head urging him to do things he had never considered before. One evening, he found himself standing outside Lilith's apartment again. She had become a constant presence in his life, pulling him further into her world of darkness. When he knocked on her door, she opened it with a knowing smile. "You're changing, Elias," she said, as if she had been waiting for him. "You've embraced the demon within." "I don't want this," Elias spat, though even as he said it, he could feel the demon stirring inside him, urging him to take what he wanted, to burn everything to the ground. Lilith stepped closer, placing a cold hand on his chest. "It's too late. The man you were is gone, and now you're free." Elias looked down at his hands, his once pure hands now marked by the demon's power. The last remnants of the man he had been were slipping away, and in their place was something far darker, a demon. And Elias, in the deepest corners of his mind, knew that he would never be the same again.